So I'm very, very honored to introduce our speaker for today, Brandon Lee. Brandon Lee is a Chinese American San Francisco native. He is a human rights and environmental justice activist who moved to the Philippines in 2010 to live and work with the Igorot indigenous people in the Cordillera region. He was a volunteer for the Ifugao peasant movement, a human rights worker with the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance, and the Ifugao correspondent for the alternative newspaper Northern Dispatch Weekly. Now, as many of you may know or may not know, especially during the previous regime, the Rodrigo Duterte regime, indigenous groups were vilified and what is termed red tagged. So red tag is typically when different groups are basically labeled in a particular way as communists or terrorists or any other kind of, insurgent group, regardless of what their actual kind of ideologies might be, but they're vilified in this way so that the state can justify violence against them. And in the case of Brandon on August 6, 2019, became the first U.S. citizen targeted by the regime for his work. And he was shot 4 times by the 54th Infantry Battalion under command of the 5th Infantry Division. This happened right in front of his home and in front of his family in Ifugao. The attack did leave Brandon permanently paralyzed as a quadriplegic, paralyzed in his hands and from the chest down. But as you can see today, Brandon is a fierce fighter, and they have failed to fight to silence him. Brandon continues to use his voice to advocate for human rights as a member of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines U.S. chapter. He was a recipient of the Center for Environmental Concerns Gawad Bayani ng Kalikasan, or Environmental Hero Award, in 2020. And for the first time since arriving back in the United States, Brandon will be traveling outside the San Francisco Bay Area and speaking on the Fight Like Brandon Lee speaking tour for a just peace in the Philippines. I do have to just add a personal note. I've known Brandon since he was a college student at San Francisco State University. Brandon ended up joining the League of Filipino Students chapter there. The League of Filipino Students was actually an organization I had also helped co-found. I remember Brandon and I were on a similar video call like this. I was asked to speak for the 10-year anniversary of LFS. And I think Brandon might remember Amado was a little boy at the time hanging around me as I was doing my speech. And I have to say, Amado really, really looked up to his Tito Brandon, knew that Brandon was serving in the Philippines. And when the opportunity to join the International Committee on Human Rights in the Philippines, to join a exposure trip there in 2018, he joined. And like Brandon, he decided to stay behind and continue to work with indigenous communities. And as many of you know, he unfortunately lost his life there in the Philippines in 2020, nearly a year, actually, just nearly a year after Brandon was actually shot. In his case, he died because of the very stringent COVID restrictions by the Rodrigo Duterte regime that prevented him from being able to seek health care for food poisoning, and he passed from septic shock. In some ways, it's also just indicative of how the Philippine government fails indigenous communities by providing them with, not providing them with adequate health care. And so Amado suffered the fate that many indigenous people suffer. But we are proud that we can still, continue the work that Amado did, continue the work that Brandon's doing by providing him a platform. So thank you so much, Brandon. It's such an honor to have you here. And I'm just so, it's wonderful that we've had this long relationship together. We've been companions in this struggle for lasting peace, justice in the Philippines, and justice for indigenous communities there. So wanted to start there, Brandon, with just your story. It's such a compelling story. Chinese American, San Francisco native, what got you to, get connected to Philippines issues, especially as a non-Filipino? What motivated you to move there and become an environmental and human rights activist?
Um, Thank you, Robin, for that introduction. I can see, much like today's atmosphere, there's international conflict right now in the Middle East, in Palestine. 23 years ago, there was a crisis nearby in Afghanistan and Iraq. And my professor at that time in City College of San Francisco, Helen Toribio, who was part of the Katipunan Demokratikong Filipino, the KDP, was against the Marcos dictatorship. Um, at that time in 2001, Helen had asked us to go on community integration. And one of the activities she put on the board is the anti-war rally. So my first exposure to what was happening in the Philippines is actually the Afghanistan war, or the U.S. war on Afghanistan. And for me, I could not just sit back seeing the collective punishment of families, women, and children suffer because of U.S. war for oil in the Middle East. In that protest against the U.S. war on Afghanistan, I was attracted to the sea of red shirts with the slogan that said, "Serve the people." And it was the Bayan USA contingent, made up of Filipino migrant workers, students, and women who were leading a lively contingent, along with other Asian migrants and Asian American activists. Um, and that definitely drew my attention. Um, so that was my intro to um, the Filipino National Democratic Movement. Um, and at that same time, George W. Bush declared the Philippines as the second front on the war on terror. So I got to learn a little bit about what was happening in the Philippines. In 2003, I ended up transferring to San Francisco State, where many of my Filipino classmates were part of the League of Filipino Students. And during one of the Balik Sambayanan exposure trip, which means return to our homeland, they came back with all these stories about the human rights violations in the Philippines. And it got me motivated to learn more and to help organize. But I was kind of like on the periphery of helping out because I saw myself more as an ally. And of course, it's not my homeland. And eventually, it got to the point in 2004 where they asked if I wanted to join the League of Filipino Students. And I asked, has there ever been a non Filipino in the organization? And they said no, but that doesn't mean there can't be one. And from there, I wanted to organize Chinese students to support Chinese immigrant community and workers. But it took a lot of work, and a lot of the Chinese students at San Francisco State dedicated most of their time to their studies. So I was unsuccessful in organizing student support for those Chinese immigrant and workers. But I got drawn in more toward the League of Filipino Students. And in 2007, I was invited to the Balik Sambayanan exposure program. But I questioned myself, my place as a Chinese person. It's not my homeland. But they said, it's okay if you want to join just to, report back what you see. So I went to the Philippines thinking this will be my only time going, and I would just help share the stories that I heard. I went on that life-changing exposure trip to the Philippines. I joined the workers on boycotting Nestle on their picket line to fight for living wages and better working conditions. Fort, the chair of their union, was killed in cold blood by state agents. Fort was dearly loved by the Nestle workers for his leadership in building the union and for his ultimate sacrifice. The Nestle workers launched their public campaign, "There's Blood in Your Coffee," to draw international attention against Nestle. Nestle, the same Nestle that believes that water is a corporate right and not a human right. In that same trip, we visited many sectors, including the most oppressed majority and largest class, the peasantry. I found out poor peasants who had been tilling their land for generations did not own it, and instead were paid only 10 pesos a day. 10 pesos is back then is like equivalent to a quarter of $1. Uh, and when they collectively protested against these low wages for their land, the rich landowners had their armed goons rain down bullets. We also visited the Igorot indigenous people in the northern part of the Philippines. The Igorots, who live on resource-rich lands, are considered squatters on their own land because the Philippine government considers any land with the slope of 18 degrees as belonging to the Philippine government. The Igorots have been fighting against these foreign occupation and colonization for hundreds of years. And until now, they have continued their fight against government neglect, like Robyn had mentioned, and development aggression, militarization, and for the recognition for their right to ancestral land and self-determination. Development aggression came in the form of large-scale and destructive mining, hydropower projects, geothermal energy projects, as well as wind farms. Essentially, it means development forced upon Igorots. On that exposure trip, our group also attended the one-year death anniversary of Alice Claver, the wife of Chandu Claver, who was the provincial chair of the Progressive Party list, Bayan Muna, and the president of the Provincial Red Cross. Chandu and Alice were driving their kids to school when a motorcycle pulled up and shot at their car. Alice shielded her husband and was riddled with nearly 24 bullets. Alice died immediately, but Chandu made it out alive. He was hit in his left arm and chest, and he could no longer practice as a surgeon and is now living in Canada with his kids after filing for political asylum. But the family today continues to be traumatized. During this trip, we joined the medical and fact-finding mission to the remote village in Kalinga. The indigenous peasants there taught us about how soldiers had blindfolded them and pointed a gun to their nape. The soldiers accused the farmers of supporting the land defenders and the resistance fighters known as the New People's Army. The Philippines had recently held a medical mission, the Philippine Army had held the medical mission, and they were giving out expired medicine to the local indigenous people. This trip 17 years ago changed the direction of my life. And I believe that we are shaped by our experiences. And this exposure program gave me new direction. It fortified my commitment to serving the fight for Philippine liberation from US imperialism, just like Amado did. And So what motivated me to become an environmentalist and human rights activist? Well, the following year, 2008, I didn't think I would be back to the Philippines after 2007. I ended up sharing all those stories to people like today, just sharing with you all today. And in 2008, I led an exposure group. And actually, one of our team leaders from the Philippines who guided us, he, the Philippine government charged him and 71 of his colleagues in southern Tagalog, where I think where even Amado was in Mindoro. Um, and those 72 people were charged with rebellion. And our guide had actually ended up doing semi-legal organizing, meaning it was dangerous for him to already like guide us in the open. So he had a bodyguard with him, someone to look over his shoulder. And the next year, the following year in 2009, um, I ended up going on a 3-month solo exposure to the province of Abra, where there were local warlords. And they had the three G's: guns, gold, and goons. That's how the election cycle was ran every 3 years, where they bribe the people with money, and if they disagreed with the politician, they were shot by the goons with guns, and the politicians would end up shooting each other, and that's how warlordism happened in the province of Abra, and we see how the state fails to build proper health facilities, proper educational facilities, even the road conditions. There were bridges to nowhere. And when I returned um, to a signal area after that 3-month integration program, I heard about Melissa Rojas, who is the Filipino health worker from the US and who was abducted in the province of Tarlac. She was conducting a health survey, and 15 men pushed her into a van, her and her two companions, and they kept her locked in a private area where she didn't know where she was. And for 6 days, she was blindfolded, tortured, double plastic cellophane over her head, dunked into the toilet, and punched repeatedly if the answers did not respond favorably. She kept just saying her name is Melissa Rojas. She's an American citizen and she's looking for her attorney. That's when they knew they effed up because they thought she was a Canadian. And internationally, there was a lot of pressure on the Philippine government to surface her. They let her go only after she promised them she would not talk about what happened. They said if she talks about what happened to her, they would hurt her family. When she flew back to the US, she didn't shut up. She told her story. She told everyone what happened. And till today, like she had testified in the Philippine Congress and filed a case to the Supreme Court. And lo and behold, several months after the Philippine military shot me, Melissa case was dismissed by the Supreme Court, saying that she showed little interest in what happened because she's not around. Well, she testified in the International People's Tribunal as well as myself. She testified in 2015. I testified this year. And shows that she very much cares about what's happening in the Philippines because there are so many people getting abducted today. And I remember a particular story right after hearing about Melissa. It was Michael Reyes. He belonged to one of seven poor peasant family, and foreign mining companies already destroyed the environment where he lived and poisoned their water streams. Michael Reyes would end up taking up the armed struggle and joining the New People's Army to defend his ancestral land. On a day when the armed forces of the Philippines ambushed his unit, Michael would sacrifice himself to allow his unit to fight another day. He was captured alive and tortured. After not gaining any useful information from him, the army would execute him by chopping off his limbs first. And it was only on the third week after he was caught that the army granted permission for the family to come and retrieve his body. By the time I got there with the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance and his family, you cannot recognize who the person was that we retrieved.
Yeah.
It was maggots already covering his body, and when they put him back together, they can only identify him based on his teeth. So yeah, this is happening around the Philippines for indigenous people who are fighting for their land, life, and resources.
Yeah, no, thank you. Gosh, Brandon, I'm just wanting to kind of take a little bit of a pause there. That's a lot that you've shared, particularly with Michael. Just kind of taking a moment to take a little bit of pause. I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that, going to the Philippines, well, I guess even before going to the Philippines, sounds like, as a Chinese American, as an Asian American, you were really drawn in by the activism, the anti-imperialist activism that was happening in the early 2000s, probably not unlike how many young people now are really taking to the streets, forming encampments on their campuses in solidarity with the people of Palestine, that you similarly were just drawn to this resistance movement, this struggle on one hand, but also wanted to, register your protests in opposition to U.S. Imperialism and also kind of U.S. agents of U.S. imperialism, right? In the case of, all of the different countries that were actively recruited as part of the United States global war on terror. And then going to the Philippines, witnessing for yourself how both, the ongoing impact of U.S. imperialism and colonialism in the Philippines, how it impacts the people of the Philippines, and yet also being really inspired by how Filipinos are organizing, Filipino workers organizing in the Nestle factories, really, that if people follow some of the resources I put in the chat, that Nestle strike and the boycott really hit hard with Nestle, really, really hit them hard, in terms of them, really feeling the pinch. Of course, you also witnessed how indigenous people were both suffering at the hands of all of the natural resources being claimed for, global business, but also the ways that they were struggling. And I think one of the things you described, right, Brandon, is there's all sorts of different kinds of resistance happening by indigenous people and their allies. Melissa Rojas was just a Filipino American health worker on a medical mission, and yet even helping indigenous people in any way was considered dangerous, such that she was tortured. And then, of course, for indigenous people under those conditions, they themselves, find that they have to take up arms to defend themselves, and then of course are met with brutality on the part of the military. I guess I wanted to just also have you take a moment to speak about what you were doing, right? They clearly targeted you. You survived an assassination attempt. But what were you doing? Weren't you were like a journalist, weren't you? Tell us more about your work. And, I think sometimes, really understanding exactly, what the Philippine state is so, finds so dangerous, right? Because clearly, the Philippine state even finds medical work somehow dangerous, that they're going to target Melissa Reyes. But what were you doing? And can you tell us if you feel like it's a hard conversation for you, I'm sure, very re-traumatizing, but if you feel like you have the capacity to share exactly what happened on August 6th in 2019 in response to your work, I think it might be, important for our audience to hear.
First of all, I was inspired by that widespread, vibrant, fearless mass movement for change in the Philippines. A movement with a vision that is taking collective action to end deep-seated government corruption, to break the system of land dynasties and distribute land to the hungry tillers who comprise the majority of the population, and to provide decent jobs at home so that 4,000 Filipinos at that time don't have to migrate daily just for work and leave their children behind. Basic services to the marginalized. Today, that number is almost double, at almost 8,000 Filipinos leaving daily. And so, equally in the Cordillera region where I would reside, I was inspired and in awe by the vivacious Igorot mass movement and culture of resistance. I mean, you saw some of the music videos earlier, how they resisted the Spaniards, and even being strong like the river, breaking through dams. So yeah, how they had that culture of resistance against the onslaught of imperialist plunder through large-scale mining and destructive energy projects, which destroy indigenous communities, including their livelihoods, heritage, and communal ethos. Um, they are not against development, but are against corporate business that only seek to feed the pocket of a few local bureaucrats and landlords. And yeah, this is not development, but rather business for private profit. It was in this, joining this struggle, that I met my partner and we raised our child. And I have met some of the bravest and most selfless activists and freedom fighters from the ranks of the country poorest, while the decadence of the country's rich is maintained by a repressive and fascist state under a US-backed puppet regime. No matter who has helmed the Philippines, they have always kowtowed to foreign interests over their own country and their own people. So I supported the strong opposition against the plunder of the Igorot ancestral lands, the violation of their right to self-determination, and state terrorism characterized by militarization, bombings, strafings, criminalization, terrorist designation, and relentless red tagging, which Robyn mentioned in the beginning, which is pretty much calling the organization or activist or community as a communist terrorist supporter. And it's all perpetrated by then US Duterte regime and now the Marcos regime. So I struggled alongside the most courageous indigenous peasants to protect and defend the rich agricultural lands and river, mountains, and forests from the biggest foreign corporations conducting widespread aggressive extraction and environmental degradation. I did this as the local correspondent of the Northern Dispatch and the local paralegal of the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance, working with people's lawyers, supporting political prisoners and their families, um, and indigenous communities, giving them human rights orientations. And in the Ifugao peasant movement, we conducted food relief in disaster-prone areas, which I think Amado did as well, building homes for the Mangyan people. And we helped with the food insecurity situation. The kamote is a sweet potato, is a staple consumed by the indigenous peasants when their native rice varieties run out after 8 to 10 months. The kamote ended up getting a virus, a fusarium wilt, a type of fungus due to the climate crisis, rendering the kamote uneatable or inedible. We partnered with the Benguet State University, who did research and introduced a cure. Well, the 54th Infantry Battalion branded the project as a New People's Army project, red tagging it, and which essentially is calling it a terrorist project. And it's tagging the Ifugao peasant movement, to which I was part of the secretariat, as a MPA supporting group. Well, if the New People's Army helped the people with the care to their food insecurity situation, it doesn't sound like they're terrorists at all. And in fact, the Ifugao peasant movement also conducted educational discussions around indigenous people's rights and the impacts of dams. And for giving those information to the people, we were targeted. And that's seen with the Philippine state's counterinsurgency program, the whole of the nation approach, which is patterned after the United States counterinsurgency program.
Right.
The Philippine, yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Brendan. I mean, I actually posted, if you weren't able to see, just the kind of activities you're talking about, what was red tagged, considered so threatening to the Philippine state, right? Whenever its vision of development gets threatened, it sort of tags different projects and people as subversive, right? Red tagging them so that they can justify any kind of military police action, right? And so just for people, look, you should see what Brandon did, right, in his capacity as a journalist, and even a little bit of information about the Kamote project that he mentioned. Now, we're coming to a close soon, but I do hope that folks continue to follow Brandon's journey. He will continue to speak, and I'm sure there will be more opportunities for people to join virtually, if not in person. But Brandon, as we come to a close for our session today, can you tell us what message you want to send to the international community, or a call to action for those of the people who are here, who are watching present today, and who may watch the video as we repost it and circulate it later? What is a key and important call to action for your campaign, and even for the broader fight for human rights in the Philippines?
So I guess I want to impart that first of all, it's not all doom and gloom. Of course, when people resist, there's always going to be repression. But the indigenous peoples today courageously keeps fighting back. They have successfully barricaded several mining sites very recently, in fact. They have halted several development aggression projects and exposed and opposed US imperialism. So how can people here help? One is to join an organization, get involved. That's how you start learning about what's happening through educational discussions. And then another one is there's legislation now introduced by Pennsylvania Representative Susan Wild for the Philippine Human Rights Act. That would essentially cut US military aid to the Philippines because I kind of brushed upon it. Aside from the torture, the threats, the harassment, the intimidation, and the political killings, the surveillance, there's also aerial bombings that have been happening. Most of these are happening in the countryside, in areas that have been identified where there's strong opposition to a lot of these corporate projects. So we would cut the US aid and military fund and training to the Philippine military and police until human rights is observed and those who are perpetrators are accounted for. And right now, the Philippine House of Representatives passed the PERA Act, which is the Philippine Enhanced Resiliency Act, which is the opposite of the PHRA. It gives $2.5 billion to the Philippine military to be used against the Filipino people. That means more bombs, guns, weapons aimed at the Filipino people, as well as training. So it's now in the Senate, and we can contact our senators to ask them to stop the PERA Act. Yeah, so those are some ways you can help. Also wanted to say, like, although I'm on the Fight Like Brandon Lee tour, I say it's not fight like me, it's fight like the Filipino people, fight like the Palestinian people, fight like the poor, oppressed, exploited, marginalized people all over the world who are fighting back against corporate greed. And, we're under this climate crisis, as most of you can feel today. It's the indigenous people who have been fighting for that environment. So we need to keep supporting our indigenous people here in Turtle Island, as well as indigenous peoples all over the world.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That's wonderful. Fight not just like Brandon Lee, although that's an important thing to say, but fight like the Filipinos, fight like the Palestinians. I've definitely posted a lot of resources in the chat, and we will ensure that we get all of these compiled after our conversation today. I did want to also just open up, we do have a little bit of time left to open up for any questions people may have for Brandon. I'll give Brandon a chance to pause just a little and then to wait for any kind of questions or comments people may have in the time that remains. You have about 9 minutes. And again, please direct message me if you feel better about that. If you have a question or comment, if you don't want to post to everybody in the room. And so we have a question here, just kind of diving even more into more depth about how everyone can better support your and the people's activism and resistance. And actually, I think it's kind of connected to Abigail's post or our chat question about specific Igorot or Ifugao organizations that people can look into supporting.
Yeah, actually, since the attack on my life, I didn't get a mention earlier. There were 5 other Ifugao peasant movement staff that were visited, and they were also aiming to neutralize them, but luckily they weren't at home. And since the attack on my life, there's a persona non grata campaign lodged against the Cordillera People's Alliance and the Ifugao peasant movement, which belongs to, which is an organization under the Cordillera People's Alliance. So if you would like to support, you can look up the Cordillera People's Alliance. And they have every year a People's Cordillera Day on April 24th. We just celebrated in the US 2 locations at UC Berkeley this year and in Hawaii, in Honolulu. And it just celebrates the struggles, the victories, and the ongoing campaigns that the Igorot indigenous people are fighting for and against.
And I guess I should also mention that in the Philippines, the Cordillera People's Alliance is also is affiliated with Bayan, the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan. So for people who are in the United States, a way to kind of connect, could be to also join one of the member organizations of Bayan USA, which is pretty much a Gabriela USA chapter or a Anak Bayan chapter. So that's another way to potentially kind of be connected because there's a real direct line of connection there. Of course, there's also specifically those wanting to support the Philippine Human Rights Act being passed. There's also the Malaya movement that does that work, and another organization that does a lot of work in support of various indigenous people struggles in the Philippines, Liang Network as well. So we can also make sure that Liang, Malaya, Bayan USA information is sort of shared with folks who are interested in trying to kind of be more directly involved to the movements that Brandon and before him, or and still really Melissa Rojas and others have kind of really supported. Any other questions?
Well, I was just gonna plug in iChirp.
Yes, of course, iChirp.
That's where a lot of the solidarity, ally, activists who want to support the Philippine struggles. Like there was an iChirp when I was around, so I'm glad there is now.
Yeah, and as far as I know, they continue to have host sort of exposure trips. That's an opportunity for people who really wanting to not visit the Philippines as a tourist, but really wanting to visit the Philippines to connect with those organizations at the front lines of really advancing genuine democracy in the Philippines. Any other kinds of questions or comments? I know sometimes these questions come after the fact, so please, if you have questions, you can contact either myself or Angela at our emails, and we can hopefully kind of address them directly or forward them to Brandon, and Brandon hopefully can respond as he can. But if there aren't any other thoughts, maybe Brandon, we do still have a little bit of time. If there's any other kind of topic or issue you feel like you want to, just end us with, please do so while we have the time.
Okay. let's see. Yeah, so what inspires me to continue this fight? Again, it's the people who continue to fight back. To this day, like the stories and sacrifices of the activists and freedom fighters fuel my commitment to continue. The Cordillera mass movement continues to paitlata. It's a term expressed by Arnold Jaramillo, also known as Kamando, who in 2014, along with 5 other Red fighters and 2 civilians, were massacred in cold blood. Kamando was caught alive and tortured before being executed by the Philippine military. Paitlata means to dare to struggle, continue to fight, fight to the end. And that's what I intend to do. Paitlata.
Thank you so much, Brandon. You're such a wonderful inspiration to all of us. Know that we are also fighting for you as you continue to do the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks to all of you who've taken time this evening, afternoon, whatever time zone you may be in. Thank you so much for listening to Brandon's really remarkable story. I think Brandon, offers us a really great example of how we can all show up. This is what solidarity looks like. And it's a beautiful and, beautiful, beautiful thing. And, wishing you well, Brandon, as you continue on this tour. I know that it's the 5th anniversary already of your assassination attempt. And, we're just so grateful that you're healthy and that you're able to continue to speak out and do the good work so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robyn.
Much love for you, Brandon. I can't wait to see you in person soon.
Oh, we have a Ilocano in the...
Yes, you do have an Ilocano in the chat. Thank you so much. All right, so please, everyone, keep join us for our last talk for this lecture series. We will be hearing from Dr. Ryan Boyko in a few weeks, but do watch out. This is a very important area for us at Amado Khaya Initiative, doing the work of advancing indigenous solidarity. It's very, very crucial and central to our work. So keep following our work as we, continue to advance our program or expand our program in Indigenous solidarity in the coming years. Again, thank you so much. Stay well, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.